Daniel was a man of science. He did not believe in ghosts, curses, or demons. He traveled the world, seeking places that were rumored to be filled with horror and death. His goal was to prove that all these stories were mere fiction. This time he arrived at an old abandoned town on the outskirts of England. The name of this place was not on any map, and all roads leading to it were overgrown with weeds. Legend had it that several decades ago, all the inhabitants vanished in a single night. No traces, no explanations. The houses remained untouched, windows shattered, and the streets drowned in silence. Those who tried to investigate either never returned or lost their minds. But Daniel did not believe in mysticism. He recorded his first impressions on camera, laughed at the made-up stories, and moved forward. Yet, as he crossed the city's boundary, something strange happened. The car, which had been working perfectly, suddenly stalled. The headlights went out, the phone lost signal. "Technical malfunction," he muttered, stepping out of the car. Silence stood all around him. Too thick, too unnatural. There wasn't even a breeze. Daniel felt something strange. It seemed to him that someone was watching him. He turned around, but behind him there was only darkness and empty houses. Nonsense, he told himself and walked on. But as he stepped onto the cracked asphalt, a sound echoed from deep within the city, a whisper, as if someone had quietly called his name. Daniel spun around sharply. The city was empty, but he felt that he was not alone. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It could have been an echo or the sound of the wind, though. There was no wind here. The air hung heavy with dead silence, so thick it felt as if it was suffocating him. He turned on his flashlight and moved forward, keeping his camera ready. The buildings lining the street looked as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. The shop windows were covered in dust, yet shelves with goods still stood inside. In one house, he noticed a table with a breakfast frozen in time, a plate with rotten food remnants, and a glass of water that had long since evaporated. "As if people just vanished," he muttered, recording everything on camera. Suddenly, something gleamed in the darkness, in the window of a nearby house. Daniel quickly raised his flashlight. No one. But he was sure he had seen movement. A figure standing there, watching him. Just a shadow or a reflection, he told himself, though a chill ran down his spine. But the worst was yet to come. When he returned to the car to grab extra batteries, he noticed footprints. On the dusty ground where there had been nothing before, now stretched wet footprints, barefoot, leading from his car directly to where he was standing. His heart pounded. He looked at the buildings, at the dark windows, which now seemed like eyes watching him, and then he heard it again, a whisper, closer. "Daniel." Cold fear tightened around his throat. He was no longer sure this was just his imagination. Daniel took a step back, his gaze fixed on the footprints stretching toward him. They were clear, fresh. Someone or something was here, close. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress the rising panic. "Logic, only logic," he whispered under his breath. "Someone is here, and they're playing with me." But who? This place had been abandoned for years. He raised his flashlight, illuminating the buildings around him. They stood silent, dark, like empty skulls. Suddenly, one of them caught his attention. The door was open. He was sure that when he passed by a few minutes ago, it had been closed. Daniel tightened his grip on the camera and stepped toward the house. Inside, it was even quieter than outside. The air was thick with the scent of dust and dampness. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor creaked beneath his steps. In the living room, old furniture stood beneath a thick layer of dust. Above the fireplace hung a warped mirror, faintly reflecting the dim room. Then he felt it. Something, as if someone was watching him. The flashlight trembled in his hand as he slowly turned his head toward the mirror. The reflection. It was not as it should be. In the mirror behind him stood a figure, a dark silhouette, frozen in the doorway's shadow. Daniel spun around sharply. Nothing. He looked back at the mirror. The silhouette was gone, but on the dusty glass, as if traced by a finger, 2 words appeared. "Stay here." His blood ran cold. Daniel turned abruptly and bolted for the door. But the moment he stepped onto the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, and the city seemed even darker. Daniel breathed heavily, standing in the middle of the desolate street. His heart pounded so fast it felt as if it might burst from his chest. He looked back at the house. The door that had just slammed shut on its own was now slightly open again. The black void inside seemed even more menacing. "It's just my imagination playing tricks on me," he muttered, gripping the flashlight so tightly his fingers turned white. He forced himself to take a few steps forward. He had to continue his investigation. He had to prove that there was nothing supernatural here, but something had changed. The city. It was not the same as it had been just minutes ago. The facades of the buildings seemed to have shifted. The windows had changed shape, and some doors that had been closed before were now wide open, almost inviting him inside. But that was not the worst part. He saw them. On the opposite side of the street, silhouettes stood in the darkness. They did not move, did not make a sound. They simply stood there, as if waiting for something. Daniel aimed his flashlight at them and regretted it instantly. They were human, almost. Tall, thin figures dressed in old, tattered clothing, as if from a century ago. But where their faces should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth grey skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. They remained motionless. Then, all at once, in perfect unison, they took a step forward. Daniel stumbled backward. "This can't be real." He shone the flashlight at them again, and they were gone. Only an empty, dead alley remained, but Daniel knew they hadn't left. They were still here, and they were watching him. Cold sweat trickled down Daniel's spine. What he had just seen, it couldn't be real. It had to be an illusion, a trick played by his exhausted mind. But he couldn't deny the truth. Those creatures, the faceless silhouettes, had been there. He swallowed the lump in his throat and kept moving forward, trying not to look back. The road led him to the town's main square. It was wide, paved with cracked stone slabs. In the center stood an old, dried-up fountain. Its statue, a cloaked figure with its head bowed, gazed solemnly at the ground. The silence grew heavier. Then a rustling sound. Daniel froze. The noise came from somewhere nearby. It sounded like the whisper of fabric, like someone moving slowly across the stone. He cautiously turned his head and saw them again, The faceless figures stood along the streets, in doorways, behind windows. There were more of them now. They were no longer hiding. They were waiting. "God damn it!" Daniel whispered, feeling his heartbeat pounding in his temples. He took a step back, and at that moment he heard them. Whispers, soft, insistent, filling his head, echoing in his ears. "Daniel, why are you here? Leave, or stay forever. They see you. They are coming." The voices multiplied. They twisted together, merging into a single, overwhelming hum. Daniel clutched his head. "This isn't real! It's not real!" he screamed. But the whispers did not stop. They laughed, and in that moment he understood one terrible truth. This city was alive, and it wanted him to stay. The whispers grew louder, blending into a dreadful chorus. Daniel pressed his hands against his ears, trying to drown them out. But the voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside his head. He had to get out of here. Spinning around, he bolted back down the street, retracing his steps. His feet pounded against the cracked stone pavement, his heart racing with fear. He ran toward his car. It was his only way out, but as he turned the corner, he skidded to a stop, nearly falling. The car was gone. The spot where it had been was now empty, as if it had never been there. Daniel gasped for breath, his eyes wide with horror. "No, that's impossible!" He was certain he had left it here. Suddenly, the air around him changed. It grew colder, heavier, and then he saw them again, the silhouettes. They stood in a half-circle around him, more of them now, their faceless heads all turned in his direction. They were silent. They did not move. They were waiting. Daniel swallowed hard. He knew that if he stayed, he would never escape. He took a step back. The figures stepped forward. He stepped back again. They moved closer. His heart pounded violently in his chest. He didn't know what these creatures were, but he could feel their nature. They were the city's inhabitants, and they did not want him to leave. "This isn't real. It's just an illusion," he whispered, desperately searching for any logical explanation. But when one of the figures took another step closer, so close that Daniel could feel its cold, lifeless breath, he knew the truth. This was real, and there was no way back. Cold fear wrapped around Daniel's body like iron chains. The silhouettes stood unbearably close now, their faceless presence almost tangible. They did not move, did not breathe, did not make a sound. And then one of them raised its hand. Daniel froze, his heart pounding violently in his chest. The entity was pointing at something behind him. Slowly, as if hypnotized, he turned around. In front of him stood the town hall, a massive, ancient building with towering windows and a half-ruined clock on its spire. It looked like the oldest structure in the city, and the most ominous. And from inside, a sound echoed, a bell, dull, metallic, ringing from the upper floors of the building. Though the clock should have been long dead, Daniel clenched his fists. "You want me to go there?" he asked the faceless figures. They remained silent, but he already knew the answer. Something was waiting for him there, something that might explain the horror of this place. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the town hall. Inside, the air was dark and oppressive. The scent of dust and decay clung to every surface. The stairs groaned under his weight, and along the walls, faded paintings hung in cracked frames. Yellowed faces of people who had once ruled this town. It felt like their eyes were following him, Higher and higher he climbed, until he reached the final door at the top, the door from which the bell was ringing. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow and, summoning every ounce of courage, pressed down on the handle. The door creaked open slowly. He stopped. Before him was a circular chamber with towering windows that overlooked the grim city below, and in the center they stood. People, real, living people, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. They stood in a ring around the bell, their faces twisted in horror, but they did not move. Who are you?" Daniel whispered. Suddenly one of them snapped his head toward him. His eyes were black, bottomless, and he whispered, "We are the ones who remained." And in that instant the city screamed, the walls trembled, the wind howled through the windows, and the voices in his head shrieked, "Don't run!" But Daniel already knew what was coming, and he knew he no longer had a choice. The room began to tremble. Glass cracked in the windows, the floor groaned underfoot, and the bell at the center swung on its own, striking with a dreadful echoing clang. Daniel stood frozen in terror. The people surrounding the bell began to move, their heads twitched, their black, bottomless eyes locked onto him. "You will become part of the city too," one of them whispered. "Just like us," another added, "like all who came before you." Daniel stepped back, but the door behind him slammed shut. Something was here, something ancient, something that never let go of those who crossed the city's boundary, and suddenly he understood. This city was not abandoned, it was alive. Everyone who entered became a part of it, its inhabitants. He remembered the faceless figures on the streets. They had been them, the ones who stayed, and now it was taking him too. Daniel did the only thing he could. He lunged forward and struck the bell. With all his strength, the bell's toll roared through the chamber, so loud it seemed the city itself shuddered. The figures around him screamed, their voices merged into a single deafening wail. The ceiling cracked, and the wind howled as if it had been unleashed from a cursed world. Daniel struck the bell again. The world shattered around him. He opened his eyes. Daylight, bright sun shone down on his face. He was in his car. The engine was running. His phone had a signal again, and the city was far behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. What was it? A dream? A vision? Or something else? He glanced in the rearview mirror. His heart clenched. On the dust-covered glass of the back window, a single word had been traced by a finger. "Come back." Daniel was no longer the man he had been before, and he knew. The city was still waiting for him.